All right, welcome to another Ideas That Matter conversation. I'm really pleased to have here. Michael, is it Spiker or Spicker? I should have asked you right away how it's pronounced.
Spiker. You got it right the first time. Most people
Well,
don't.
that's good. Yeah, it's amazing. This will be a total side note how a name like Sadler can be so easily mispronounced by people as Statler. So I imagine yours, where there's an ambiguous vowel in it, leads to that all the time. So Michael is somebody who I've been following for quite a while because of something we're going to talk about, the Aesthetics Research Lab, which is a really cool project. It's got an intriguing title, and there's a lot of material available. But Michael's also a fellow adjunct professor teaching at several different places in the Boston area, all of which I would say, I'll ask you this in just a moment, they have to do with your area of specialized research, right? There's Boston Architectural College and Massachusetts College of Art and Design. And the last thing that I'll say, and then I'll turn it right over to you, is that one of the reasons I wanted to bring Michael on in particular is I teach at Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design here in the greater Milwaukee area, and a lot of our students, they get a lot of aesthetics thrown at them, but not in as systematic a way as you'd like. There's no philosophical aesthetics class there, and I'm thinking of developing one. And so to get to talk to somebody who not only specializes in aesthetics, but also the history of aesthetics, which maybe you can tell us the distinction between those two fields, is a real treat for me. And I think this will be of use for my own students and many other people as well. So let me start with this. Did I leave anything off that you think really needs to be brought up or highlighted about your work, your thought?
Not necessarily. I mean, except that just to get a little bit more specific, when I beyond teaching, I find just from, and we can get into this a little bit more when we talk about the Aesthetics Research Lab itself, but uh, I just sort of found myself in several different contexts.
Okay.
One that you some of which you would think would be more concerned with aesthetics, and they're not. I mean, or at least not in any sort of substantive way that I would think is important. And that is the beauty industry, the fashion industry,
Yeah.
architecture, and business. Those are sort of the four contexts I kind of circle around in for different reasons, either in writing, uh, conferences, other kinds of webinars and collaborations, and so on. So I think that'd be the only other thing I would add to what you've said is like I write a monthly column for a beauty industry resource called Beauty Matter, and I have a book coming out, my first book coming out this summer,
Oh,
July 11th.
congratulations.
It's an edited volume and it's on digital fashion. So philosophers in particular are not very keen on writing and talking about fashion, let alone a very cutting edge idea of digital
Yeah.
fashion. So, uh,
I will say something, and I'd like to get your reaction to this. So I taught at Marist College for, in person quite a few years, and then I did it online. And Marist is really well known for their fashion major because they're close to the city. They can send their students down there, and one of the things. So actually, two things I observed: the other majors act as if these fashion kids, these majors who are studying this, are really like, they're doing something that's easy and not very rigorous or anything like that. So they look down on them, and the fashion majors often have a sense of inferiority in relation to the other students who are viewed as pursuing more serious works. I found they were some of the best students that I had in my classes because they were used to working very hard, following the instructions, but also trying to surpass them, trying to anticipate where problems might arise. They were just a delight to work with. And once you could get them talking in class, particularly when we were talking about things that had to bear on aesthetics or ethics or metaphysics, they surprised themselves how good they were. And I'm wondering if you have any uh similar experiences or insight into that.
To be honest, I actually have not had many fashion majors in my classes for
Okay.
some reason. I've had a lot of people from different arts, like painting and sculpture, a lot of people from arts education. I've had students that I don't think you can major on this in particular, but it could set you up to get a master's in arts therapy,
Right.
and some things like that. But yeah, I once in a while I've had a fashion person, but I don't recall too many for whatever reason. The different departments have different requirements, so I think that
Yeah.
it might be for whatever reason it might be a hindrance for them to take. Because I'm actually housed in the history of art department, so it might
Oh, okay.
be that because they have fashion history that they don't take classes in history of art as
Yeah, I
much.
mean we have similar things happening in various schools with ethics, where if I actually saw at Marist, they had farmed out ethics to the business school, which okay, that kind of makes sense. But there was a communication ethics class that the philosophy department totally missed their opportunity to teach.
Uh,
I think they kind of saw ethics as like, that's kind of a slum. We don't want to do that. Let's farm it off to other people. But it was a very poor strategic decision if you want to keep, your enrollment up and department alive. And so, these other disciplines, they stopped sending their students to our ethics classes because they had their own ethics class.
Yeah, I will say though, I haven't taught philosophy major since I was a PhD student, and what I like, I mean, philosophy majors are interesting because they bring up, especially when by the time they take an aesthetics class,
Yeah,
they've had some classes, so they might bring up, really specific questions about what did Kant mean by this distinction or something, whereas our students don't, and design students don't really have those questions, but they're more concerned with how can this help something that they're actually working on. And so I've
right.
actually, I teach history of aesthetics at Mass Art, and um, to try and make it clear that I don't want to just dwell in abstract ideas, I call my course History of Aesthetics, and then the subtitle is Putting Theories into Practice. And I try to
Okay.
show each week that, or whenever feasible, either, how we might still think about this, or how maybe even a specific example of how someone still applies this. In various ways. So I think it creates an interesting challenge, and I think this relates to kind of our both of our involvement in public philosophy,
Yeah.
because they're kind of representing the public. They're not interested in the analytic synthetic distinction or
Or if they
or
are, you better make the case why they should actually care about it,
yeah,
right?
but they're really curious, and they're really creative about their approach, which I think would drive maybe some strict analytic philosophers crazy, but for me, I kind of like that they're thinking outside the box and being, because I know the thing is, I know they're not going to be philosophers, so it doesn't matter that they get every single little thing correct in what I think they should get correct. Like, I mean, I want them to know Aristotle was Greek and not a German philosopher, but
Yeah.
some basic stuff, but to me, it's more like I want them to think through some of these ideas and how it influences what it is they're working on. But I also just like teaching in art school because you never know what might what you might see. One semester a few years ago, a student brought a giant fish puppet into class
Oh, wow.
because it was for her next class.
I get that in my in-person classes. I'm teaching online this semester, so I don't have that experience and I kind of miss that. The what would you call it? Unpredictability of
Yeah,
what they're going to have. I also noticed this too. I'll ask you this, and then let's jump into some more philosophical things. So at my ad, if you're the kind of professor, coming in from other places who expects the students to be like, focused on you the whole time, boy, you're going to get really upset because they're doodling and working on projects, or some of them are, doing other things with their hands like knitting.
yeah.
And but they'll poke their head up and they have been listening. They're on point. They know exactly what you're talking about, but their attention is directed elsewhere, or at least appears to be directed. elsewhere. And I imagine, do you have the same experience with your students?
Exactly. I actually had a student apologize for knitting the other day, and I was like, "But you comment and contribute regularly, like they."
Yeah.
So so it was like not a big deal. Like if I'm more concerned of, I mean, and there's a sense in which it depends on someone's pedagogical views. Like if they want to zone out, that's on them. Some people have that kind of attitude, but for me, I at least want some students participating, and it didn't affect anything about their participation. So
Yeah. So we've been using this term aesthetics, and I'm not expecting you to do what nobody else has ever succeeded in doing, which is to give like the definition, because there isn't consensus. There's like overlapping ideas, but I think it is useful for listeners, watchers to have some general sense because the term gets thrown around a lot in our culture. I actually, when I was a kid, my mom worked at a school of aesthetics and cosmetology. And aesthetics there was cutting hair, nails, and a few other things like that. So some people I think might associate it with just that sort of thing. And then there's, the other extreme. Oh, it's a philosophical discipline, this very, abstruse thing only for a select few.
yeah.
What is aesthetics? I'll just put it to you this way. What does aesthetics mean to you because I'm sure your students will ask you in class after class, what the hell does this term mean?
I'm sort of in the middle of what those two poles you just defined. Um, and I will say that uh, like it's become popular. Maybe it's sort of waned a little bit, but on social media, especially like Instagram and TikTok, I think, and maybe Snapchat, but at least Instagram and TikTok, uh, different things that were my aesthetic, and so
Yeah, yeah.
I'm the only philosopher I know who has been interviewed by Glamour magazine for an article on my aesthetic. So,
Yeah.
but so people have that kind of view, and it's just mostly revolves around what their own physical appearance or the setup in their lifestyle, the aesthetic of their
Hmm.
lifestyle. But for me, before I kind of get into the main idea of what you're saying, the one thing that I would say specifically relating to philosophy and probably also the newer fields of science that are studying aesthetics is we conflate aesthetics with art too
Right.
much.
Yeah.
Uh, and in philosophy, I can't. I want to say it was Yuriko Saito. She wrote the book in Everyday Aesthetics in like 2007 or so. I want to say it was something that she wrote, and I actually can't find it. But I read. I know I read somewhere where people kind of counted the articles in of a certain time period that were in the top journals on aesthetics. So like the British Journal of Aesthetics, the Journal of Aesthetics and Art Criticism, and these big journals. 90 something percent were all about art. Um, and I think
Yeah.
that's a huge problem. Philosophers are supposedly good at making distinctions.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
for some reason, we just talk about aesthetics as if it's philosophy of art and philosophy, and they're the same. And so when I define it for my students, well, not really define it. When I set like a range for my students, I tell them aesthetics has to do with the broader questions of beauty, the sublime, aesthetic experience, aesthetic taste, those kinds of things. And those can be found lots of places. Whereas philosophy of art is specifically focused on what is the nature purpose of art, maybe things like are there ethical responsibilities for artists, and those kinds
Yeah.
of questions. And they clearly relate, but they're distinct. And so that's why I kind of make it clear that I focus on aesthetics, even though I occasionally dip into philosophy of art. But I would say if I was going to offer like a working definition, here's how I pulled this up. Here's how I defined it, or like as a working definition, and,
Okay.
and,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
maybe even to hedge it more, a flexible working definition. I wrote for Beauty Matter in an article called "What Do We Mean by Aesthetics?" Aesthetics consists of the qualities of perceptual objects that people encounter in their experience and how those objects affect the person who experiences them. And there's probably lots of problems with this. And I think one of the problems is I'm sure some philosopher out there would think that I'm making aesthetics too broad. I feel like that's a bullet I'm willing to bite.
Yeah.
I'd rather
Yeah.
do
Yeah.
that than go the opposite way. So another project I'm finishing up, and we don't have to get into this right this second, but if we want to talk about at some point, is I've written a little book called "Is Your Business Beautiful?" And it's a book to show how aesthetics permeates all aspects of business, and some of which surprised me when I found people writing about them in business. And
Interesting.
like even there's a book on organizational aesthetics.
Okay.
And then there was an article that even your business plan should use qualities of aesthetics. And this author, um, he even referred to like technical concepts like disinterestedness and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
So so I was sort of surprised. I mean, but I found pockets of people all throughout business in different facets that uh, have some kind of connection with aesthetics and think it's valuable. It's just that as a whole, it's not. And the only other thing I will say that I think is very important for this discussion of aesthetics in other contexts is I have recently, it's been recently made very clear to me that in people in design, and this is something I'm up against at a design school, think
Yeah.
of aesthetics as pretty, and that's it. So it's very, very reduced to some really shallow.
That's interesting because I would expect that there would also be attention to we could call them more formal aspects like the proportions of things, so a logo should not look clunky, right? It should be elegant or smooth or
Yeah.
convey certain things. And okay, beauty, prettiness is certainly part of that, but
Yeah, I think they don't think of those clunky and those things as aesthetics. I think they think of
oh,
those as functional.
well,
And
that's
that's,
interesting
and
because
I mean, that's my sense from certain
yeah,
people I've talked to that do design.
one of the things I'd wanted to kick around with you. And again, I approach this as a non-expert in aesthetics, but who's, inevitably talking about this with my students at various times. So, you mentioned the beautiful, and we could contrapose to that whatever the opposite is, the ugly. Like the Greeks had the whole range of the kalon and aisron, right? Which could be beautiful, handsome, fine, and foul and things like that. And then you've got the sublime, which is also really quite important. But it seems like there's like just tons of categories out there that we don't necessarily think of them in a structured way as aesthetic categories, but they are aesthetic categories. When we say that something is cool or that something is boring or, to use some of the kids lingo, cringe, right? That's an aesthetic quality, isn't it? I mean, it's not necessarily only an aesthetic quality. And so to talk about a design logo and they only appreciate, these things, maybe they don't see those as falling within aesthetic categories.
Yeah, I'm not sure that they do. And and so that's part of my mission at teaching as at an architecture and a design and art school is
Yeah.
to sort of help dispel that. But I do have there's a lot of people that don't have those that don't reduce it to something very shallow. But
Yeah.
even in the beauty industry, I see people talk about beauty standards as if people just created these out of thin air and but for me it's because it's a really important drive for people. That's why you're able to exploit it. If
Yeah. Yeah.
it's not because we created it and just no. So now details we might create, the fact that everyone's buying these shoes now or this, or people like some companies will declare the fall color is red, or whatever. But
Yeah.
like, so those things are artificial, but the drive for beauty is not. And I think when you talk about different categories, one of the things I think a light bulb sometimes goes off in people's minds when I talk about this is we often think of aesthetic qualities as positive,
Right.
like
Right.
the beautiful, the sublime, the dainty, the graceful,
The
elegant, all these.
elegant. Yeah.
But there's especially in the political context, there's a very real negative aesthetics. Uh, and I know that like the joke, especially I don't know if this is beyond if this goes outside of philosophy, but I know in philosophy we always joke about all ethical discussions are 6 degrees away from Hitler. But but Hitler, he didn't have charts and
Yeah.
graphs.
Yeah. Yeah.
He said he described people as disgusting, and
Right.
it
Right.
created a visceral reaction. And now I don't think aesthetic uh, terms like that are gonna, all of a sudden make someone go 180. You have to already maybe have a tendency towards something for them to work, but they do get people in a frenzy rather than, and aesthetic qualities work for nonprofits. A powerful narrative is going to get more donations than just here are good reasons to support us. Here are the statistics and data and so on. And so we even talk about the way that scientific evidence is presented has an aesthetic quality. And
Yeah.
even I recently read an article by a guy talking about the aesthetics of storytelling for your business. Oftentimes we think of the telling the business's story as a way to a nice, cute way, of conveying information. And his point was if your story doesn't kind of create, to some degree, an aesthetic experience
Yeah.
for its own sake, people aren't going to remember it. It doesn't even like so it doesn't matter what information you give, it's not going to be memorable. But if it's a memorable and it creates a kind of aesthetic experience, people will not only remember it, they'll also tell everybody else because it's
Yeah.
that much of a powerful story.
I mean, you think about like Aristotle in his rhetoric talking about ethos or character being the most powerful means of persuasion, in addition to, logos or a counter argument, and then, pushing people's buttons with the pathos, with emotion. Business storytelling, when it's done well, would necessarily involve that sort of character description, providing examples. Look at, this guy's a used car salesman, but he's not going to screw you over because look at the good thing he did over here. But I think you're right that if it doesn't have reference to, let's call them sensory experiences, that it's not going to be as powerful. I mean, we can use words like, I mean, so here's the most generic, good character, right? And then we can zero in a little bit more, and we can say, um, that somebody is fair in their business dealings. But we need the specific example, and we need it works even better if you can visualize that person putting their handle on or their hand on the car door handle, getting in, and being like, I didn't think I'd like this sort of car. Well, why don't you take it for a test drive? And we could tell like a whole crazy story about it, right? And it strikes me that so in philosophy, who would be responsible for that? Would the ethics people want to handle that? Most of them wouldn't. They like, cases and abstractions and making decisions and stuff like that. But that's really important. That's what motivates people in real life. Would the metaphysicians? No, they're not. They don't care about that. Or the epistemologists, they'd be like, well, who knows if this guy's really honest or not? So maybe aesthetics is where we kick this into, and you can actually explore these sorts of important matters.
Yeah. Well, and and it's kind of since you were talking about the ethics and abstractions and stuff, the first time I ever taught an ethics class as a graduate student, it was a course that we called contemporary moral issues, and it was in the summer. And so
Okay.
it's 4 hours, I think, at a time
Oh,
from either maybe 8:30 to 12:30 or something like that.
that's
And
tough.
and I was thinking, well, how am I gonna do this? And so I had just read Kurt Vonnegut's short story collection, Welcome to the Monkey House. And even before I knew I was teaching this course, I thought this would be great for an ethics class. And so,
Yeah.
so anyway, I was like, well, I'm gonna do this, and I ended up showing the movie Slaughterhouse-Five and
Okay.
and stuff as well, and like on the last day, I think. Uh, but what it did was it kind of helped me realize right then and there during that semester, during that summer 4 week semester, that uh, philosophers aren't that creative most of the time because here's Kurt Vonnegut having these stories that are
Yeah.
so nuanced. And I know that thought experiments are often not supposed to be necessarily creative. I mean, some of them are,
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
but they're supposed to just highlight some small piece of the problem. But here's Vonnegut having a story. There's one called All the King's Horses, and this plane falls down or gets shot down in enemy territory, and it just so happens that there's 16 people on the plane, just enough for one side of a chessboard. And so they play this life-size game of chess. Um, and in a moment of like utilitarianism versus deontology, the highest ranked guy, I don't remember what his exact rank was, colonel or lieutenant or something. Um, he realizes in a moment, it basically reads like utilitarianism, like all the pieces became numbers, and he realizes
Yeah.
I can sacrifice one piece to save everybody else. But one of the pieces was one of his twin sons. And so his
Oh,
wife, of course, was like kind of represents the deontologist and says, we can't do that all, even if it means we all die. And so like that it's the stories. And what I found with ethics too, specifically a course on moral issues, is that too often people focus on themselves. Well, like the death penalty, the famous counter argument is, what if it was your mom falsely
yeah. Yeah.
accused, or whoever, your wife
Yeah.
or someone. Um, and But when you talk about the story, it helps people get a certain distance from like thinking about themselves and how the moral issue affects them. um, and they could talk, well, what should this person, or what could this person have done, or what might they have done otherwise? And I found
Yeah.
it to be
Yeah.
very effective. And then the stories are just good
Yeah.
because he's a master writer.
Yeah, I mean, I've used stories here and there in my ethics classes, and then I do this Worlds of Speculative Fiction series, and very often there's some really great ethical dimensions in Philip K. Dick or Ursula K. Le Guin or
Yeah.
Octavia Butler, or all these sorts of people. I suppose that would be a really interesting experiment. I mean, there is a textbook out there that I remember running across. A colleague was using it. It was an anthology, and it was trying to pair together classic short stories or little vignettes, even not quite story length, with ethical theories. Um, and I think I've still got it laying around somewhere in my stacks of books, because you know how they send you all these textbooks. Um, but I never actually got around to it. I just sort of cobbled things together. And I'm kind of curious, turning this back to aesthetics, um, to teach aesthetics, whether it's sort of like a topics oriented thing or a historical way. Would you do that as well, using short stories, literature, for conveying ideas? Is there enough out there to do that?
I have not done it with aesthetics. I've thought about doing it, but I have not
Yeah.
yet really combined the two um, as much. I've taught courses on history of aesthetics, aesthetic theories, the philosophy and science of beauty, and aesthetic taste are kind of the main ones I've taught so far.
Okay.
Yeah, I haven't. But I think it's partly because a lot of times what I do is I refer to a lot of artwork, and so
Yeah. Yeah.
that
That's the
takes the
natural.
place,
Yeah.
or natural environments,
Yeah.
or architecture, depending on where I'm teaching. But I do refer to a lot of pop culture things like movies and stuff. Although I remember there was a dry spell with The Matrix for a while. And now that the new one had come out, was a couple years ago or whenever that was, uh, people kind of know about it again.
That's true. I found that, so I first started teaching in the late 90s, and then, in the early 2000s, you could talk about The Matrix, and you could even talk about like Memento and Dark City, and other artsy, interesting,
Yeah,
ideas heavy movies like that. And boy, did they quickly age for an undergraduate audience. The Matrix seemed to have more staying power, but
yeah.
the others, it's if they just like fell off a cliff,
Well, there's so
within a
many,
few years.
And yeah, you brought back memories with Dark City. Man, I love that movie.
Yeah,
I haven't
it's
seen it
great.
in years. And then there was that kind of weird one, Brain Scan. Do you remember that one?
No, I never saw that.
With Edward Furlong.
Okay.
Um, and Primus does like some of the music for it. I mean, or they use Primus songs for some of
Okay.
the music.
Yeah.
It was kind of a weird one, but it's still the same, like questioning what is real and that. And actually, students I think don't really know about uh oh man, my mind just went blank of what it was called. The one with Leonardo DiCaprio um from like 10 years ago.
Oh,
Uh
10 years ago.
or 15 years ago maybe.
We're not, what, I might be mixing that up. Is that Inception?
Yeah, that one.
Okay.
Like
Yeah,
like I
sometimes I
think they
get these
don't know that
stars
one
mixed up.
now.
Yeah, another one that's like a real sleeper that was great, was 13th Floor.
Yep, I
Um,
saw that one too.
I used to bring, back when we actually had like DVDs and we could bring them into class, and I'd do that. But haven't watched it for a while.
Yeah.
So, well, one of the things I wanted to ask you about, shifting topic a little bit, you mentioned these four classes that you teach, and one of them is history of aesthetics. So, what benefit is there to taking a historical approach, which is what I had when I took an aesthetics class as a grad student? They did pretty much everything. Like, well, we start with Plato and then move onward. A lot of people in philosophy like to say, well, there's real philosophy and then there's history of philosophy. I'm not a fan of that because I'm a historian of philosophy. But what's the case for having a history? I mean, why should we care what Plato and Aristotle or even Kant, who's closer to us in time,
Yeah.
thought? Why not just focus on 20th and 21st century stuff?
I think for me some of the greatest books of the 20th century in philosophy, stuff like After Virtue, Theory of Justice, they all had historical components.
Right.
And
Yeah.
and so I think that's a practical for someone that wants to have a book that does well. I think that's a practical I mean there may not I mean I'm sure there's not a there may not be a way to prove that, but it does seem to me that the books that have really taken off and had the widest reach had history
Mm,
components to them. Um, but for me, I teaching where I teach, I think for me it's all about showing the students that none of these ideas are brand new.
okay.
And even so, like Plato in the Symposium connects beauty and knowledge, and uh, and so we still have a certain kind of connection. We may not connect it with all the metaphysical baggage of
Right.
Plato and
Yeah.
stuff,
Yeah.
but we connect it. Like if I said I'm a painting connoisseur, and you said, well, how many paint? Like you must have seen a lot of paintings. How many? And I said, no, I've just seen one. Well, there's some
But
kind
the
of
best one.
knowledge,
Yeah.
but it doesn't have to be formal knowledge.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm pretty sure most people would think Eminem knows words, but he's a high school dropout, and so
Yeah.
he
Yeah.
clearly has knowledge of how to put words together, and about how to mix beats and different things. Like he clearly knows that, and he
Yeah.
has no real formal education in that, to my knowledge. I don't think I don't even think he has a certificate of rap from some college. you know,
I wonder if anybody offers that. There's probably some sort of like program somewhere, right, that
Yeah.
does that. It's
Um,
probably not very good.
but I'm actually, I mean, it's interesting that you bring specifically that question up. What
Yeah.
I've seen is I collaborate and or interact in different ways with a lot of people in architecture and design who are very much enamored with newer concepts and branches of in science. One being neuroaesthetics and one being empirical aesthetics more broadly, and then
Okay.
other evolutionary psychology that deal with aesthetics. And what I found is because it's new, and I think this is true of a lot of the sciences that kind of split off from philosophy, because it's new, they interact a lot with philosophers, but one day they'll split off completely and probably not talk as much about it. And I think for a lot of them, they
Yeah.
don't see the history. They don't see that some of the ideas that they're proving in neuroscience now about our aesthetic, what delights us and different things, philosophers have already said it most of the time. A lot of the
Yeah,
ideas
yeah.
aren't new, so which I think is better. I think that's stronger that you're confirming an idea that's been around for 800 years, for example. Like different things about our perception of light and how light affects
Okay,
us.
yeah,
It
yeah.
goes, I mean, it probably goes back even earlier, but Thomas Aquinas, one of his three conditions of beauty is radiance, which is light and color. And so just to show that to two different people working now. And so I have a Substack, um, and I've started
Which we'll
this,
put a link to as well. I'm a follower and I'm a real fan.
what I'm calling the History of Aesthetics Project, because I
Yeah,
think a lot of people don't a lot of the well, there's two problems. I think a lot of people don't turn to philosophy for aesthetics, if because they're just not aware that it's there. And then the second
yeah,
problem is the books that I might read and find valuable for the history of aesthetics are probably largely inaccessible or too abstract and not really
yeah.
like just getting into some of the intramural debates that most people don't really care as much about. I mean, I actually recommend Monroe Beardsley's History of Philosophy because it's one volume. It's it's dated. It's from the 80s or maybe even earlier, the
That's
70s.
one of the texts that we had in our aesthetics class.
And
Um,
yeah, and so I still recommend that one. But and then there's new ones, like 3 volume sets and different things like that. But people are not going to read those. But they also
yeah,
want to see how one of the things that they don't see in these books is how these ideas from history still matter. I don't think most of these history books don't really talk about that. They're just trying to be more informative and that's it.
yeah,
Or maybe argue for certain interpretations, but they're not really trying to argue for um, this distinction or this idea in you know Moses Mendelssohn
yeah, yeah.
like matters somehow to us today. Uh,
And that brings up another question that I hadn't thought to ask you about. And so I'm just going to like throw something out there and get your reaction to it. In philosophy, we often fall into the trap of thinking that if it's not universal, it's not any good. So we have to have an explanation that like covers everything. And it's very difficult to do that in aesthetics because you've got so many, it's got such a wide range of phenomena, even if we like stick to the high arts or something like that. Because you've got visual arts, right? And that's already a mess because you got painting and drawing, which are pretty close to each other. But then there's sculpture, and you've got to move around the sculpture. And lighting makes a bigger difference, you could say, to that than to those. And then we have music, right? And we can talk about music not just as something you listen to, but the performers is there dancing involved, right? So there's all of that stuff. We have literary matters, which Plato and Aristotle are devoting a lot of their aesthetic thought to. Aristotle's poetics is basically, I mean, he does talk about a few other kinds of mimesis, but they only get a line. So sculpture gets mentioned, but then
yeah.
let's talk about tragedy, right? And who knows, maybe in Lost Book 2 or 3, that stuff was covered, but it sure isn't in what we have. And I think a lot of people, at least this is my take as somebody who's an amateur in this field, when they're talking about aesthetics, even somebody like Hegel, who's got a lot of different fields that he's covering, it's only going to go so far and it's not going to cover everything. So, we could talk about the aesthetics of dining in a restaurant. There's a lot of attention focused on that in fine dining, but we could even talk about, what it's like to go to McDonald's or, to hang out at a food truck or something like that. What's that experience like? And I think that we shouldn't expect any one, we'll call it theory or account, to do everything. And so maybe what we need is like a mosaic or, a composite picture of a number of different theories, which we could cull out of the history of aesthetics, because there's been so much work done in the past, and then we can say, okay, so students or business people or general public, here's some things to work with. Does this help you have a richer, more informed experience, and maybe also be able to say, yeah, I don't want any more of that crap. I want better stuff over here to make good judgments
Yeah.
about things. So I guess the thesis is what we need is not a single theory of everything, which nobody's managed to provide, but some good stock things here and there. I mean, you think about the weirdness. We don't expect like one dish to be the one thing we're going to eat from now on because it's the
Yeah,
best. I mean, I like spaghetti
exactly.
and meatballs ever since I was a kid. If you ask me what is your favorite dish, that would be it. And there's a lot of possible variations, but I sure as hell don't want to eat spaghetti and meatballs every night.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I'm trying to perhaps pioneer um,
Hmm.
is we when we talk about ethics in philosophy, it does not that's an umbrella term for meta ethics,
Right.
ethical theory, and applied ethics.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
if you open up any handbook of aesthetics from Oxford to Blackwell, Rutledge, if they have something called applied or maybe one of them says practical aesthetics,
Okay.
it's painting, sculpture, dance. It's that, and never
Oh,
fashion, first of all, but
yeah,
but
yeah.
and but I think what I want to do is sort of pioneer a different version of practical aesthetics where I show how it affects business, government, and then social issues like climate change, prison reform. I'm in Massachusetts. Most people, or the majority, high percentage of people would if they had to vote or if they took a survey, do
Yeah.
support things that will help alleviate climate change? I'm sure the majority of people would say yes. Off the coast of Nantucket, they were going to put a wind farm for as an alternative source of energy. The very wealthy people that live on Nantucket uh, bought it because it's ugly.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
there's a designer in Denmark. I forget her name. I want to say it's her last name maybe is Marjan, Marjan. She gave a TED talk. She's a designer who's working on problems with solar energy, and one of the first things she says in her TED talk is, why are solar panels ugly? And so her
Yeah.
goal is to design solar energy that and surfaces that do not look like solar panels. And she designed this thing that looks kind of like a mini greenhouse that goes on the top of like an apartment building in a city.
Okay.
And she said the best compliment she ever received was someone saying, where's the solar panels? And she's like, the whole thing is a solar panel.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
so it's these kinds of things. And then for prison reform,
Oh.
I went to a talk once with Reginald Dwayne Betts was one of the four speakers, and he's a formerly incarcerated now poet. And I don't even think the conversation or a question had anything to do with aesthetics, but one of the first things he said when it was his turn to speak is, there's no beauty in prison. And we might think there are people that might think, well, who cares? They're prisoners.
Yeah, yeah.
But who else is there besides incarcerated persons? Corrections officers, and that was kind of made like that point was made very acutely when I read American Prison by Shane Bauer. He's a reporter for Mother Jones, or a journalist from Mother Jones, and
Hmm.
he applied to any private prison in the U.S., including all the way from California and so on. But the first one that just happened to call him back was in Louisiana, and he got a job there. I think the book came out in 2015 or so. So this isn't that long ago,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
he was making about $8 an hour as a corrections officer, and on his after his few weeks of training, the first day he steps into to the prison for real, um, shadowing another corrections officer. Uh, the prisoner, one of the prisoners asked him, "Oh, so you work 12-hour shifts, right?" And he said, "Yeah." And the guy's like, "Ah, you're doing half my time with me." And
Yeah,
it's
that's a good one.
very
Yeah.
uh it corrections officers have such a high degree of stress and anxiety and depression and
Yeah.
suicidal
Yeah.
ideations,
Yeah.
and I think it's partly because they're in such an ugly environment all the time. And the
You
thing
know,
is, we
okay.
may not care about people while they're in prison, but one thing we should care about is that we should not want them to go back. And prisons that
Yep.
have famously in Norway have very, very, very low recidivism rates. And if you look at the prisons, they're much, much nicer. And
Yeah.
they actually help reform people, not just simply uh, punish them mentally and physically.
I'll say two things, because I completely agree with you about this. So one is, the food in prisons is pretty bad. I mean, the prisoners can make their own food with stuff that they buy on commissary, usually about 4 to 5 times what it costs us when they earn, very, very little. Um, at Indiana State Prison, we used to have this thing called the Officers Dining Club. And that was a big euphemism because it was, what it was is they would bring out the same food that the prisoners were being served. And this is before Airmark came in. They, privatized it and had
Mm,
Airmark take it over. So the prisoners would make food for themselves. Everything in a prison is basically, other than guarding them, is done by fellow prisoners. And you could buy, it was almost like when you were in high school, middle school and high school, you'd buy like a punch card that, would have
uh,
meals on it. So you would buy this for $5 and a meal was 50 cents. And then they would punch your thing as you went in. So you would get the same food that they were getting. And, there'd be things like a salad and it wasn't very pleasing. And some of the stuff would be rotten. And then there might be a meat dish or something like that. And the food was, for 50 cents, not bad, and you didn't have to go out to get something when you were teaching these, basically 9-hour days at the prison. And, and so a lot of the officers would do that and we would chat with them while I was teaching. And I remember one day they made spaghetti. And of course, the spaghetti is like, thick like ropes because it's been boiled so long, but you can kind of overlook that. They
mm,
ran out of sauce. So what they did is they supplemented it with barbecue sauce. And it was terrible. Of course you eat it. And for me it was kind of an interesting thing. I was like, well, I'm teaching these guys. I'm not just teaching them like technical skills. I'm teaching them, things in philosophy. We're talking about values. It would be good for me to like experience a little bit of what they're experiencing
yeah.
and learn not to complain about it. So there was that aspect. And of course that went away once Aramark took over. And then we all had to go out to like, the local diner, stuff like that. And the prisoners got much worse food. But the other thing that I observed that was really quite interesting, and I've seen this at multiple prisons, is the prisoners themselves will not all of them, not most of them, but many of them will do their best to try to modify their environment to introduce some beauty. Like they'll make paintings
Mhm.
or drawings or even just how they tidy things. There's this emphasis on you can't let your bunk be all messed up because, you walk into somebody else's cell and you don't like seeing that. Of course, everything else is still crap around you, but, the little bit that you can control is important. And, they have things like culinary arts programs. At Christmas time, you would see as you're walking in the front gate these displays of gingerbread houses that prisoners had made. And, some of them were pretty amateurish. Not that I would make anything better. Some of them were incredibly talented at this essentially visual, three-dimensional artwork and design work with, you know, weird ingredients to try to make something
Yeah.
that they could take pride in, that they could feel was their own. And so I'm very receptive to this idea that we should make prisons better places aesthetically, um, ethically, of course, too. But
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
When you mentioned if you're interested, in 2020, you can imagine it was not a good year to release a
Oh,
book.
right.
But
Yeah.
but one book that seemed to not be hindered by 2020 is a book on art making in prison, and it's called
Mm.
Marking Time: Art in the Age of Mass Incarceration by Nicole Fleetwood. I can't praise that book high enough, and it won too many awards to count, but it sort of set the new standard for it. And I don't I've not been inside of a prison doing anything specific, but I work or I volunteer for a prison book program that sends books, free books to incarcerated persons in all 50 states, and even we are capable of doing it to Puerto Rico and Guam, but we haven't had many
Oh,
many requests from there. But there's
yeah,
so
yeah.
many rules, as you can imagine. I'm sure you know that we have to be
Yeah.
very careful what we can send, and even some rules that wouldn't make sense, except that it's a waste of time to send it, knowing that it's going to be rejected. But
Yeah,
uh,
and one again, one I don't want to lead us too far afield, but one of the really sad things to see is there'll be these prison libraries, and then like a new captain comes in, decides that they're gonna like, shake things up a bit, and one of the things they do is just like throw all those books out, and you're like, this is one of the few good things that these people have. Why would you do that? Why would you engage in that sort of cruelty? you know um and sometimes they'll say things, well, they're a fire hazard. You're like, they're not a fire hazard. I mean, you're just making this stuff up.
yeah.
But
One
yeah,
of the
it's
rules, one of the rules that we have to abide by when sending books is, they say no maps.
oh, I
Um,
can understand that. Yeah,
and
yeah.
but they take it extremely literally. So we recently got a book
Like,
sent back to us rejected because it was The Hobbit and had a
I was gonna
map
say Middle
had a
Earth.
map of Middle Earth. So I'm not sure how a prisoner is going to use that to his advantage, but
Yeah, that's rather crazy.
so I know we sort of got off a field here and talking about prisons, but to bring it back to aesthetics, one of my favorite stories when people talk about how, or when people maybe they don't even say it explicitly, but they have sort of this attitude that aesthetics is something that you add to your life when
Right.
everything's going well
Yeah,
or
yeah.
whatever. One of my favorite kind of stories to the contrary is from Primo Levi in his book If This Is a Man. He talks about how he was in Auschwitz, and one day him and a fellow prisoner, it was their job to walk across the camp to get the lunch for their group that day. And so, of course, they took the most circuitous route possible in the
Yeah.
prison camp. And as they're walking, they just start talking and trying to like feel like human beings for a short while. It's apparent that this other Primo Levi's, fellow prisoner did not had never read Dante. And so he starts reciting passages, and
Oh,
he
wow.
gets to this part where he can't remember this connecting line, and he says that he would have given up his daily food just to remember. And keep in mind, a concentration camp, they didn't have state regulations like prisons in like supposedly have, where they're supposed to feed people 3 times a day or
Yeah,
whatever.
yeah.
So this is it. It was like his only meal of the day he would have given up. And he says, because for those brief moments, I forgot who I was and where I was. And to me, that's part of the power of aesthetics. We don't always have those kinds of acute experiences. Sometimes it's just that um, an aesthetically pleasing coffee cup is like just a nice thing to have.
Yeah.
Um, and I actually think everyone, and I would almost venture to say everyone, but I'm a little apprehensive because I'm sure there's someone out there that says no, not me. But I think most people have some kind of functional object that they bought that one versus a different one specifically for the aesthetic qualities of it. Yet the object is perfectly functional, and that's what its goal is. It could be a coffee cup. It could be even like it could be a vacuum cleaner, a toaster
Yeah,
oven.
yeah.
Like something that you bought where you could have gotten something else that would have worked, functioned just as well, but you chose one over the other because of aesthetic things. And I think most people have something like that um, in
I
their
think
lives.
I think that's right, and that leads us into another area that I wanted to get your take on. And it's a messy area, right? And there's really like two parts to it. One is when it comes to matters of aesthetics, very often you'll hear people say stuff like, well, that's all just subjective. It's just taste, you know. And here's the second part, you know, there's this long standing, you know, you can't dispute about matters of taste, which clearly is not the case because we do, in fact, dispute about them. And there's theorists out there who, you know, like Kant in the Critique of Judgment, explain to us how it is that we're doing this. You know, we produce these things that seem like and they really are rational arguments, but they don't have the same applicability as you know, moral arguments or things like that. So I'm sure that you must run into a lot of people, just as I do, you know, as a professional ethicist, who are like, ah, man, that's all subjective. Different people have different values. You really can't, you know, and they're using it as like a conversation ender most of the time. So what do you do when that happens?
But I usually just ask, have you ever heard of John Ogilvy? Because David Hume said Milton is better than Ogilvy,
Yeah, yeah.
obviously. No, I'm sort of joking there, but I do point to that even Hume, who said taste can be nothing other than subjective, said, well, but obviously we think Milton is better than Ogilvy. But what I point to is one thing I usually point to two things. One, that the idea of beauty is in the eye of the beholder, I always refer to as an unquestioned assumption.
Yeah.
We're so comfortable saying that without ever thinking about what it really means. And I especially with students, I tell them, do you know that that's actually not that old of an idea in human history? Most philosophers, I mean, I'm sure someone has argued that the seeds of that statement go all the way back somewhere to some ancient Greek philosopher, you know, maybe, or something like that. But
I mean, in ethics, yes, but I don't think so in aesthetics,
okay,
you know?
yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, I thought there was someone that someone I read someone referred to as kind of hinting at that idea, but anyway,
Yeah.
it's still kind of a new idea. So that's one thing. So how do we know we got it right? But then this is where I actually do, because people are so enamored with science, this is where I do kind of point to things and say, um, one of the most basic, there's a distinction that needs to be made. Uh, People that have done in studies where they've talked, like shown people images, and it's become apparent that people have a high level of agreement when it comes to naturally occurring things and a
Okay.
high level of disagreement when it comes to artifactual things. So it seems like and part of the reason for that is one of the longest conditions of beauty is considered proportion.
Yeah.
It goes all the way back to Plato and Aristotle. Um, but if I were to tell a group of artists, let me make it more specific, a group of painters,
Yeah.
make a painting that somehow incorporates proportion. I mean, how many different ways could you interpret that?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like you might have one painting that's just symmetry, perfect symmetry. Another
Yeah.
painting that has like objects, might be still be abstract, but objects of various sizes, but it has an overall balance and harmony. Um, and so I usually refer to that, but they have shown, you know, as far as they can show this in different studies in psychology, that people actually have a very much close to universal agreement about human faces. Um, and it's because and it's partly because of what we're familiar. So this is why I think we disagree about like objects, is because
Okay.
we're often uh as I understand the kind of science and philosophy of perception, and Benson Nane does a lot of this and he touches on it a little bit in his very short introduction to aesthetics by Oxford. Um, that what we're familiar with, we tend to gravitate toward. And I have a very real example of the
Okay.
opposite of this happening. In the late 90s, someone let me borrow a CD of Zakir Hussain, a hand drummer from in India, and it was a jarring experience to listen to because it
Yeah.
was unlike anything I had ever heard before. And so the way I understand, and I'm sure like a psychologist or something would have like some kind of correction to this, but the way I understand it is that when we hear or experience something that is way different outside, like very far outside of our individual normal. So it's not like a normal, like a universal normal, but I have a
Yeah.
normal of
Yeah.
what I'm familiar with, and you do, and everyone else does. Um, when something deviates so far outside of that, your brain doesn't know how to process it right away, and so we might think, "Oh, I just don't like it." Um, and that's why like someone that listens to like classical music and turns to metal, it just sounds like noise, or punk, or whatever
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
example. um, and but until you like kind of learn how to hear it or learn how to see it a little bit, you may still not like it, but it's not for the reason you think anymore. And that's sort of how it's been,
Oh,
very over, like probably
yeah.
oversimplified,
Yeah.
but explain to me.
That's a really important distinction. And in order to like, you know, thoughtfully reflect on that or to talk to another person about that, they're like, well, why don't you like this? You have to be able to articulate that. And, going back to this, can we actually dispute about matters of taste? One of the things I really do like about Kant is that he does say, well, we do make arguments to each other, which are unconvincing most of the time, about why you should have the same response that I do to this sort of thing. And I think there's a real benefit to that. Even a lot of people say, well, if it doesn't convince, it's not a good argument, right? But I think that a lot of these times it gives you something that then you can linger with,
Mhm.
And I've got this friend who's actually there in Boston. He's a guitar professor at Berkeley,
Cool.
and so, he has his students do critiques of each other's work, just as, at my they're doing critiques of each other's visual
Mhm.
works or stuff like that. And one of the big challenges, I'm sure you've run into this, is getting them to go beyond the I like it, I don't like it, it's cool, it sucks, and
Yeah.
actually articulate why. And again, we don't have things that are completely universal. So I can listen to a song and be like, well, that's kind of boring to me. And then you can say, well, okay, why is it boring? And now we actually have a conversation that's possible. Or I can, look at a piece of artwork and say, wow, this is amazing. And you could say, well, go beyond that. Give me something more than amazing. Why do you think it's amazing? And I think there's something intrinsically valuable about that, even though it doesn't give us the yield that a lot of people want it to give us.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I definitely, so I actually have an assignment that my students will be doing for next week. um, uh, where we start my history of aesthetics course with the some of the main definitions of art that have been
Okay.
offered, the classical ones and the contemporary ones. And what I have them do for their first like it's not a major assignment, but first like non-regular homework assignment is pick one of the definitions we talked about, and find a specific work of art, and explain from the work
Yeah.
how it either exemplifies or subverts that definition.
Okay.
And so they have to
Yeah.
point to
Yeah.
specific examples in the work itself, whether it's the theme, the composition, or so on. How does it actually overcome it? And what ends up happening is when we discuss it, and what I don't know. I actually don't know last semester if it frustrated them, or if they were okay with it. But what ends up happening is they realize most works of art, depending on how you frame your argument, could kind of go both ways for any
Yeah.
of the definitions. So like we think of imitation art as it has to look like something, but there are people that have argued that Mark Rothko is part of the imitation theory of art because he imitates psychological states that he makes visible what is
Huh.
normally not
Yeah.
visible. So now, whether people think it's a cop out or not, that, this whole other thing, but at least people have tried to offer that.
There's a plausibility to it. I mean,
Mhm.
thinking about the ones that I've seen and thinking about my own emotions, I'm not inclined to say that, they convey what, anger is like or desire is like or stuff like that. But and here's the thing, I could see how somebody could see that,
Yeah.
And so I think there's a certain value in these kinds of explanations to making us think further. Now, can you take stuff like that and bring it into context, like a business context or, the beauty industry or stuff like that? Do you think that it's ripe for that, for getting people to have those sorts of conversations?
I think so. One of the things I mention in the book that I'm finishing up called "Is Your Business Beautiful?" One of the things I talk about, so I divide into three sections of what I take to be the three broadest like areas of business: product, place, and people. Um,
Okay.
and so in place, I bring in a lot of stuff with the architecture and the space, the lighting. Um, but one of the things I also bring in is the artwork that's in some buildings. Um, and we don't engage with it because
Yeah, yeah.
we're like not supposed to.
Even
Like,
in places where it's a prestige product, like a hotel.
yeah. Yeah, we go to an art museum or a gallery. We sort of siloed these areas, and so I actually challenge people in this book. One of the ideas I had is, why not your next meeting use the art in your building to start the
Mm,
conversation about something. Now, maybe it's
yeah.
a specific painting that maybe, like, I don't know if there's a problem that you need to address. You start with this painting that you think helps illustrate the solution. I mean, maybe that's too specific where that wouldn't necessarily happen,
And it depends
depending
on
on
the
what.
painting
Yeah,
though, right?
depends on the
Yeah.
painting. But or if you're in a bigger building that has lots of artwork, um, get people to, everyone, most people have, pretty much everyone has a phone. So get people to snap a picture of their favorite work, or
Yeah,
something
yeah.
to email to something, like, in case it's not like easily movable, but
Yeah, yeah.
and have them talk about what that work does. And like somehow use this stuff that you're with every day. Because what happens is we often walk past art that we see, like statues and stuff that you kind of just become used to. You just walk past
Yeah.
too often, and sort of forget that it's there until someone else, like, that hasn't seen it yet, goes, "Oh, look at that statue," and you're like, "Oh yeah, that." I've seen that 1,000 times.
It's interesting because teaching at a place like my ed, because there's two galleries in the basement where they've always got something going on, and there's another gallery on the first floor, and then every single floor there's student art everywhere because every class puts their stuff up, and I love it because, well, not just artwork but product design stuff,
Yeah.
all sorts of really cool things, architectural drawings, because they do have an interior architecture design major. And, when I'm not teaching, I'll like wander the halls basically and just kind of like look at stuff. And sometimes it's some students I've had in my humanities classes, and I'll be like, oh, that's cool. I like, the fact that I know this person. Most of the time it's students I don't
Yeah.
know. And I've tried pitching this to many of my colleagues. You should go and just tour my ad because it's like, being in an art gallery, or not a gallery, but a museum. Because just the sheer number of things. Never had anybody actually take me up on that. Any of my colleagues at Marquette or other places, um, I'll take my kids and they appreciate it. They'll walk with me, kind of attentively down the halls and get into things. But it's unfortunate because you have this incredible opportunity. And we could say
Yeah.
this too about natural beauty. Fortunately, here in Milwaukee, because of our socialist past, we have way more parks than most major cities do per capita, and a lot of people just kind of blow past them. So I mean, does that point to a need to like teach something like attentiveness to people, or maybe not teach
Yeah,
it, but
I
encourage
think
it?
so. Yeah, I absolutely think so. There's someone, kind of a acquaintance, I guess sort of loose colleague in in some sense in New York, and she takes people for walks in Central Park because they don't do it otherwise.
Oh, yeah, interesting.
And it's and then once they do, they're like, why don't I do this more
Yeah,
often?
yeah, yeah.
But yeah, I think and well, what since you mentioned art school and having a lot of artwork, one of the first things I just came up with this idea. I don't know if it was last semester or then a semester before, but no more than like a year and a half ago. Where on the first day of class, I want to get into the idea that aesthetics is practical day
Yeah.
one with my students. So the first thing I do before we talk about the syllabus, before I even introduce myself, really, I divide them into groups and I ask them this question. And it's sad that you can count on this question being good. You'll understand what I mean by that in a second, because the space is so bad. We
Oh,
What would you change about this classroom
yep.
aesthetically? Where you have to, it still has to function as a classroom. So it's not like we're changing it into a different type of space. It has to be a classroom still. And one of the things that they say at the art school is, why aren't there art on the walls in the classrooms? Like surely some student would want to paint a mural. Uh, and if nothing else, you might think of it as exploitative, but it, I'm sure someone would do it if you just bought them the materials, just because they
Yeah.
love doing it. But so I asked them three categories, three levels, I guess. What would you do if you had no budget, so you had to just use
Okay.
objects you have at your house, or that like that one might reasonably have at their house. Like maybe you don't have any old paint, but a lot of people have old paint at their house.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
like what would you do if you had no budget? What would you do if you had like a modest budget of like $500 to $1,000 or something? And then what would
Okay.
you do if you had like a really big budget of like ten to $20,000? And they focus on the same exact things all the time. The desks
Really?
are terrible. The lighting is horrifying. Uh,
Yeah, yeah.
the fluorescent. I never turn the lights on unless it's so dark that we can't see each other. The lighting is so awful in the fluorescent lighting, and
So there's kind of like a performative contradiction going on, in other
yeah,
words, right? Yeah, yeah. I mean, I can say the same thing about the classrooms that I teach in at my ed. There's no art on the wall. They're not very aesthetically pleasing. The walls are painted because everything's new. We remodeled the place a
yeah.
couple years back, but it's fluorescent lighting. And we don't have the option of not having it on because they're interior.
Oh,
And
they have no windows. Is that what you mean?
well, those the classrooms I'm teaching in, yeah, they're
Okay.
centrally
Yeah.
located in the building, and the carpet's nothing to brag about. It's very useful, and I'm sure it's easy to clean, but there's nothing about it that makes you say, oh, I like looking at this. Um, and you've got a whiteboard that may or may not be clean in one part of it. The desks aren't bad compared to the desks we've had, but they're all pretty boring looking. There's nothing about them that makes you say wonderful experience.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
the thing that I always try to emphasize too with classrooms and other spaces is think about, and this is not, there are definitely counterexamples to this, but generally speaking, think about classrooms, libraries,
yeah,
museums, and stuff
yeah,
geared toward children. And then think about the analogous spaces for adults.
yeah,
All of a sudden, you turn 18, you can vote, you can smoke, and you don't need aesthetics.
yeah, exactly.
What?
Well, where they do have the nice aesthetics is the professions that have plenty of money. So
Yeah.
Marquette University, where I teach occasionally, they built a beautiful new business building. And I've been in there because we actually had the Wisconsin Philosophical Association um, in there on a weekend. And we were like, holy crap, this is beautiful. This is gorgeous. All the classrooms are, there's
Yeah.
wood paneling. It's just, well lit. It's all very nice. And then you go back to your own classrooms, and it's kind of a dump. So
Yep. I gave a one-off lecture in a neuroaesthetics class at Harvard and had a very similar experience. Like, wow, this is actually a nice classroom. It has paintings on the wall and wood paneling and
Yeah, yeah.
but
Yeah, I mean, but it is telling. And I think, this is an important intersection between aesthetics as such and these other fields like politics, in the broad sense, deciding who's a priority, who's not, if you matter, well, you get nice surroundings. If you don't, you get
even just
whatever there is.
even just trees. Just
True.
having
Yeah,
trees.
yeah.
Um, yeah, it's pretty sad. One of my other kind of this is way before I had any of the vocabulary of aesthetics that I have now. I went to do this. I went to help this like nonprofit that gives just for 1 week volunteer that gives like food and clothing to homeless people in
Okay,
Philadelphia.
yeah, yeah.
And we walked through the projects, and
Mm,
I was just thinking, how could anyone have any hope living here? I mean,
yeah.
is it better than a cardboard box on the street? I guess, but not by a lot. It was so dark and dismal. It was like instant depression.
Yeah. Well, and then you add in the other senses, smelling mold, smelling mildew,
Yeah.
garbage, things like that. And people just, we have this here in Milwaukee, we used to have a lot of pollution. And part of it was from these tanneries. And every once in a while, when the wind blows the right way, you smell that smell coming off the Menominee River, and you're like, oh man, that's rank, and then you think about, well, what's it like to live right down there? How does that impact people's lives? And these are very important issues that often get just kind of sidelined, I think. I did want to, before we wrap up, so the aesthetics research lab, how did you get that started, and when people hear laboratory, they're thinking like test tubes and things like that. What is its task? What is its function?
I so the short version of how I got to that point, and then I'll explain what it is because I had, connections with art my whole life. I always sort of thought, well, now that I'm into aesthetics, even though I know it's not the same thing as art, but it
Yeah.
connects, and maybe arts organizations, art museums, and so on are kind of my people. But then when I moved to Boston, I had this is about 2015. I didn't know anyone here, so I just started trying to meet people. And two different conversations, 2 different days with 2 different people, they both said, "Well, maybe architects and designers are your people." And then it
Okay.
just kept going from there. And so what I realized is I was running into people in all sorts of fields: law, politics, product design,
Yeah.
architecture, fashion, business management, and so on and so on, and uh, and then learning about issues like climate change, prison reform, things like that, and healthcare that need more attention to aesthetics. And I was like, all most of these people feel alone. Like
Mm,
some of them actually explicitly said it. Most of them didn't, but it was like there were just these pockets of people. So nothing brought all of these people together. And even with like the everyday aesthetics, I'll call it a movement for lack of better words in philosophy. It didn't to me. It didn't go far enough.
yeah.
It was a good starting point, though, and it was a necessary starting point. But I think it hasn't gone far enough in taking aesthetics and showing how it actually affects all sorts of things. And so I wanted to create I originally sort of conceived it as a think tank. I don't know if it lives up to that name so much, but I wanted it to be a place where all of this stuff, all these random places where I've found the value of aesthetics, from either ideas that I come across, or specific people,
Yeah.
and share and bring it together in one place. And I think in some ways that's whatever I think it's been somewhat successful, but in whatever I think has held it back is I think it doesn't have a specific vision like architecture or just
Right. Right.
business or
Yeah.
just this. So I think that sort of maybe some people might say it spreads it too thin, but no
It
one else is
sounds as if the
doing this.
vision is being a nexus
Yeah.
to assemble things together.
But I finally have gotten other people involved. I haven't really announced it yet. I plan to do that soon, but I've put it up on the website. I'm calling four people thinking partners, and
I
so
saw it, yeah.
one person is a cosmetologist turned philosophy student.
Okay.
One person is is an expert in lighting design. One is a business consultant, and one is an art advisor. And I think they represent kind of the main areas that I've been involved in anyway. And so um, it's kind of cool to have people that are specifically involved. I mean, it's not a paid position, so
Yeah, yeah. Well,
so it's more like it's more like getting. I think people too often saw ARL as just a blog. And on one hand, it's like, okay, I get it. But
yeah.
I think adding people to it helps it seem more like what I had originally intended it to be, which was like people collaborating together on raising, pointing out ways in which aesthetics is sort of everywhere. I mean, going back to some of the ideas in John Dewey's Art as Experience, with I think really like he kind of says aesthetics is part of every experience, and when
That's
aesthetics is
right.
the
Yeah, yeah.
dominant thing, that's what we call an aesthetic experience. And I think we ignore that aspect, and I think he sort of got it right, at least that part of it. And
Yeah.
yeah, so that's that. So the vision is to be a resource for people to uh, see. And even though an article might be about business, someone in a different field may still see how they could apply those ideas, to their own
Well, I
work.
was going to say a lot of the articles there have not only, great philosophical depth, but they're bringing in things that you wouldn't automatically associate with aesthetics, sorry. Um, and might associate with another field of philosophy. Like, recently you've got a thing on connaturality, right? Which is a very interesting topic in moral philosophy, epistemology. It's got, really deep roots in arguably it's in ancient, but definitely in medieval philosophy. And you're making a case for why adopting that, sort of point of view could be helpful. And I think that's it's sort of emblematic of what people will find on the site. So it's not just all right, you want to do aesthetics, kids? Here you go. Here's the cookie cutter thing.
Yeah.
It's very thoughtful pieces, you could
Well,
say.
and now that I have the Substack, I kind of decided that the website will be a little bit more not academic, but a little bit
Hmm.
more weightier.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
the Substack will be a little bit like a little bit more informal in certain ways, and so that'll be kind of my distinction. And I picked up connaturality from an existential Thomist, Jacques
oh,
Maritain,
okay, yeah,
and
yeah,
he directly applies it to art.
yeah.
In his one of the things that he's one of the philosophers I think is just woefully neglected by non-Catholics. His book,
And woefully neglected by Catholics, and when it comes to his aesthetic stuff, by Maritain scholars.
yeah, his book, Art and or Creative Intuition in Art and Poetry, is
Yeah,
to me a brilliant, brilliant book. Even if he's wrong, or
yeah, yeah.
like, I mean, it's just brilliant. It's so original. He's such an original thinker, and I think people think he is just someone that was Catholic his whole life, and they don't realize that
Oh, that he was a
he and
convert. Yeah.
yeah, he and his wife had a suicide pact. They were
Yep.
gonna, if they couldn't find a reason to live in a year, they were gonna end their lives, and they became Catholic. And so, I
Yeah,
mean, it's
yeah.
it's such a strange thing. But yeah, his book. I've read all of his books on aesthetics. He has The Responsibility of the Artist, and Art and Scholasticism, and Jill Sohn too. I know you know these medieval people. A lot of people
Yeah,
don't.
yeah.
I think it's sad, because I think Jill Sohn is an amazing scholar too. Um, but Maritain, I think longer I've been in it, I think my own like existential leanings like bring me to him.
I mean, there were a lot of guys within that vast sphere, you could call it, of French, let's take Catholicism seriously, but fight a lot with each other, who have a real attunement to that. Gabriel Marcel, for example, he he was very interested in all sorts of things. He loved Rilke's poems so much that he actually set them to music. There was a period of his life, a short period, where he just quit doing philosophy for a while and just concentrated on music. And it wasn't like, early on. It was kind of late in his time. But you got all these guys doing that sort of stuff and seeing the interconnections between um, aesthetics, moral philosophy, metaphysics, epistemology is sort of a breadth of vision, you could say, you
Yeah,
know?
yeah, absolutely. Definitely.
Yeah.
It's
Well, this is a good place, I think, to leave off, but we might have further conversations in the future. So thanks so much for being generous with your time and insight and reflections on this. And we'll put links to all of the things that you've mentioned here in the video description. So it's been a real delight to chat with you about these things.
you too, Greg. I'm glad it worked out. And I know you said you were battling some sicknesses and all sorts of things. So
Well, there's always something, right?
yeah, yeah, exactly.
So you either like, say you're not going to do things because of that, or you find another time to do it and you just plow through. I mean, here's the thing. So I'll end on this pessimistic note. All of us are getting older, so it's not going to get any better.
Yeah, exactly.